Fort Hill, South Carolina, is a kingdom built on cotton, its fields stitched into the earth like a living quilt of white and green in the spring, while in the autumn, whole acres become a storm of bent backs and iron hooks. The house itself is a temple of oak and ambition, its rooms ruled by the ticking of French clocks, the rustle of silk, and the unmistakable smell of waxed walnut and lamp oil, as though civilization could be distilled into scent. In the study, paper crackles under fingernails. Every contract, every loan, each bill of sale for a field hand is pressed into bound volumes, as if the act of writing can banish uncertainty. The Calhoun name is etched into brass plaques at both church and courthouse, declared from podiums and pulpits, a word swollen with pride and sometimes warning. A visiting nephew, unused to the plantation's rhythms, will gape at the silver service and the oil portraits that seem to watch him, but the overseer's whip, resting near the door like an afterthought, is a reminder that wealth here is never purely ornamental. To stand in the parlor is to hear the tick of borrowed time and the faint, metallic scent of coins pressed into palms, loans called in at the start of each harvest, debts settled in kind, not mercy. Down the hall, the mistress's skirts brush the floor in a methodical whisper, but her gaze always lingers on the lawn, where workers move like shadows beneath the live oaks, their voices a hum underneath conversation and carriage wheels. In the kitchen, every cleaver's chop echoes, salt-cured hams hang from the rafters, and molasses seeps into the wood grain, the only sweetness permitted in a house otherwise bound by ledgers. And yet, there is always an undercurrent, a faint pulse beneath all this splendor. Accounts from the quarters describe nights when the wind carries whispers of distant sails, of family split without ceremony, and the creak of a door left ajar, a signal for those who know to look. In a bedroom above the drawing room, a young woman with hair the color of corn silk stares out at the fields, her breath fogging the glass, her fingertips tapping the sill in a rhythm like Morse code for longing. She remembers, as one remembers the scent of lightning on the air, the day she first glimpsed a ledger entry written too quickly, its blur a secret almost missed. The overseer, whose boots are the first and last sound some will ever know, counts his steps between the ledger and the porch, as though one misstep might topple the entire facade. The house, for all its size, cannot hide the draft that slips under the doors, carrying the scent of ash from the slave quarters' hearth, a quiet promise that not all fires can be controlled. Would you erase an entry to save a life, or let the record stand, knowing no one reads the small print? By winter's first frost, the polished floors gleam with reflected moonlight, the inkwells are set aside, and the ledgers remain closed, but the whispers persist. The house, for all its walls and shutters, cannot contain the memories that drift through its halls, stirred by the thud of a gavel in Washington, the clatter of a chain dragged across the yard, or the distant cry of a whippoorwill that some say brings news from the unseen. In the master's study, the ledger remains, its spine cracked from use, its pages heavy with names and numbers, a monument to order, but also to silence. Yet one page, the one with the blotted ink, remains just obscure enough that sometimes, in the right light, it almost seems to breathe, as though waiting for someone to read between the lines, to uncover the story beneath the figures, to hear what the house will not say aloud, that no fortune is ever truly safe, and no ledger can account for every living heart. There is a bedroom at Fort Hill where the paper on the walls is patterned with trailing vines, and if you press your ear to the glass after dusk, you can sometimes hear the distant rhythmic clang of a hammer, an echo that never quite fades, no matter how tightly you close the shutters. This is the room of the youngest Calhoun daughter, a girl who has learned by necessity to watch more than she speaks. Her gaze is restless, drawn to the margins, a tutor dismissed without explanation, a favorite house servant sold south, a sudden quiet at meals where only the clink of silverware fills the space. The Calhouns, after all, move through their days according to rituals as unyielding as the brass schedule of prayers hanging by the grandfather clock. Yet this daughter marks every tremor in their routine, every fissure in the household's polished surface. The room smells faintly of lavender and lamp oil. Her hands, ungloved when she is alone, trace the grain of the oak writing desk, pausing where the varnish has worn thin. Each morning, she watches the sun rise through the muslin curtains, counting the shadows of field hands as they pass beneath the live oaks, their voices low but unmistakable. The law forbids her to speak to them, but not to notice the way their shoulders move, the way their songs seem to answer the wind. Her governess once warned her that curiosity is a dangerous virtue for a woman, but it is the one heirloom the family cannot confiscate. She wonders, sometimes, how many women before her have sat at this window, watching as Fort Hill grows richer, grander, and more secretive with each passing harvest. Her days are a study in measured restraint: morning prayers, embroidery lessons, supervised walks through the gardens where every rose is as pruned and contained as the household itself. But there is a world beneath the surface. For every correct curtsy, there is a whispered warning between enslaved women in the kitchen. For every lesson completed in the parlor, there is a murmured bet between the field hands about the next sale. She learns to read the ledger of silences, the unwritten history that pulses beneath Fort Hill's veneer of order. The overseer's boots, heavy on the porch steps, send a ripple through the house. The master's temper flares like a struck match, then is doused just as quickly with bourbon and business. What happens to the old cane cutters, she wonders, once their hands grow too slow for the fields? Where do the ledgers say they have gone, and do those pages ever flutter in the night, as if restless with untold stories? Would you remember every omission, or let the erasures blur into the background, like ink dissolved by lamplight? She is not supposed to see the ledger herself, but in a rare, unguarded moment, she catches a glimpse, an entry written too hastily, a blot where ink has spilled, the faint impression of a word scratched out. The overseer, sensing her presence, slams the book shut, but not before she understands the Calhoun fortune is built as much on absence as on cotton. In the parlor, her father entertains senators and judges, their laughter muffled by velvet drapes and the ticking of the French clock. But upstairs, she listens for the sound of boots on gravel, of chains rattling out by the quarters, of a hammer striking iron in the night. She knows, in a way her mother never will, that a household can be both a sanctuary and a cage, that every candle at Fort Hill casts both shadow and light. By nightfall, the weight of watching sits behind her eyes, heavy as the iron key to the plantation office. She dreams, sometimes, of breaking the silence, of raising her voice above the murmur of propriety and the scrape of pen on parchment. In the summer heat, she leaves her window open, letting in the scent of magnolia and the far-off smoke of the quarter's cook fires, proof that life burns even where her family does not look. As she drifts toward sleep, the last sound she hears is the overseer's whip, cracking once, twice, against the stillness, not a warning, but a reminder that every silence at Fort Hill is held in place by force. Yet even now, as she pulls the quilt over her shoulders and watches the moonlight play across the oiled floor, she knows that no wall, no custom, not even the Calhoun name itself, can keep a heart from wondering, from watching, and perhaps from waking. There is a sound at Fort Hill when the house is asleep, a pulse beneath the plantation's quiet that the Calhouns never seem to hear, the clang of a hammer meeting iron, ringing across the fields like an unspoken promise. The forge, a low stone building with a roof that smothers the night's glow, belongs to the plantation's blacksmith, a man whose hands are mapped with scars as intricate as the vines on the heiress's wallpaper. When the rest of the quarters fall silent, the bellows sigh, the coals glow like embers in a dog's eye, and the hammer's rhythm becomes its own kind of language. It is here, between the strike and the sizzle, that the youngest Calhoun daughter sometimes finds herself, her slippers whispering against the tamped earth, her shadow flickering on the wall as she watches the blacksmith work. The air in the forge is thick with the scent of smoke and molten metal, a mix that clings to wool and skin and memory. When the nights are warm, the blacksmith sometimes leaves the door cracked, and the breeze that slips through carries the scent of honeysuckle from the far side of the quarter. They do not speak at first, forbidden by more than just plantation law, by more than just the ledger and the lash. But a shared curiosity is a hard thing to extinguish. He glances at her from beneath his brow, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. She, in turn, studies his hands as he turns a piece of wrought iron into a latch, a hook, a tool that will ease some small burden at the plantation. He is careful to keep his distance, to pretend he does not see her in the doorway. She to look as though she is only passing by, her footsteps light as moth wings on a summer night. But their silence becomes its own kind of negotiation, a fragile truce between danger and discovery. Months pass, and the meetings become unspoken rituals. She with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, he with the fire reflecting in his sweat. Sometimes she asks him to show her how to work the bellows, and though he hesitates, he teaches her the rhythm. The heat licks at her bare arms, the scent of scorched cotton mingling with the tang of iron, and for a moment the plantation's rules seem to lose their force. Sometimes he lets her hold the tongs, and together they shape a piece of scrap into a small, useless thing, a leaf, a star, a token that would mean nothing to anyone but them. In these moments, the forge's glow feels less like fire and more like stolen daylight, a brightness that defies both the night and the ledger's order. Would you risk everything for such a small moment of connection, or turn away and let the night swallow the proof? Whispers begin, of course, soft as moths, but just as tenacious. The overseer's boots pause outside the forge's half-open door, listening for voices that do not belong. The master's horse, restless in its stall, whinnies as though sensing intrusion. Even the field hands, who say little and see much, glance sideways at the pair, marking when the heiress's footsteps do not return directly to the house. The plantation's silence, usually so absolute, becomes a fragile thing, threatened by every glance, every accidental brush of fingers over a cooling piece of metal. Yet the two continue their dance, each step weighted with the knowledge that discovery would mean separation, punishment, perhaps worse. The blacksmith's hammer, once a tool of labor, becomes a metronome for their stolen time, each strike a reminder of what is at stake. Then, one night, as the rain drums gently on the forge's roof, they stand closer than before, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the anvil, close enough for him to see the freckles on her cheekbone, for her to notice the scar above his thumb. The air smells of wet wood and hot iron, and the flames cast shifting patterns on the wall, as though the night itself is conspiring. He hesitates, then touches her wrist, a gesture so small it would go unnoticed in the ledger. But here, in the glow of the forge, it is an act of quiet defiance. For a moment, the plantation's order falters, the distance between them collapses, and what began as curiosity becomes something forbidden, something alive. The rain outside intensifies, and the sound of it on the roof is loud enough to hide their voices, should either speak, but neither does. Instead, the silence between them is its own kind of conversation, one that requires no ink, no ledger, no law. And so, in the shadow of the forge, in the scent of smoke and damp earth, in the pulse between his hammer and her heartbeat, a secret is born, one that will not, cannot, be recorded in any official record, but will live nonetheless, bright and dangerous, as a forgotten coal burning in the dark. That night, when she returns to her room, her hands still smell of iron, her breath still quickens with the memory of firelight, and the plantation's accustomed quiet suddenly feels like a lie, waiting to unravel. There is a sound at Fort Hill when the house is asleep, a pulse beneath the plantation's quiet that the Calhouns never seem to hear, the clang of a hammer meeting iron, ringing across the fields like an unspoken promise. The forge, a low stone building with a roof that smothers the night's glow, belongs to the plantation's blacksmith, a man whose hands are mapped with scars as intricate as the vines on the heiress's wallpaper. When the rest of the quarters fall silent, the bellows sigh, the coals glow like embers in a dog's eye, and the hammer's rhythm becomes its own kind of language. It is here, between the strike and the sizzle, that the youngest Calhoun daughter sometimes finds herself, her slippers whispering against the tamped earth, her shadow flickering on the wall as she watches the blacksmith work. The air in the forge is thick with the scent of smoke and molten metal, a mix that clings to wool and skin and memory. When the nights are warm, the blacksmith sometimes leaves the door cracked, and the breeze that slips through carries the scent of honeysuckle from the far side of the quarter. They do not speak at first, forbidden by more than just plantation law, by more than just the ledger and the lash. But a shared curiosity is a hard thing to extinguish. He glances at her from beneath his brow, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. She, in turn, studies his hands as he turns a piece of wrought iron into a latch, a hook, a tool that will ease some small burden at the plantation. He is careful to keep his distance, to pretend he does not see her in the doorway, she to look as though she is only passing by, her footsteps light as moth wings on a summer night. But their silence becomes its own kind of negotiation, a fragile truce between danger and discovery. Months pass, and the meetings become unspoken rituals. She with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, he with the fire reflecting in his sweat. Sometimes, she asks him to show her how to work the bellows, and though he hesitates, he teaches her the rhythm. The heat licks at her bare arms, the scent of scorched cotton mingling with the tang of iron, and for a moment, the plantation's rules seem to lose their force. Sometimes, he lets her hold the tongs, and together they shape a piece of scrap into a small, useless thing, a leaf, a star, a token that would mean nothing to anyone but them. In these moments, the forge's glow feels less like fire and more like stolen daylight, a brightness that defies both the night and the ledger's order. Would you risk everything for such a small moment of connection, or turn away and let the night swallow the proof? Whispers begin, of course, soft as moths, but just as tenacious. The overseer's boots pause outside the forge's half-open door, listening for voices that do not belong. The master's horse, restless in its stall, whinnies as though sensing intrusion. Even the field hands, who say little and see much, glance sideways at the pair, marking when the heiress's footsteps do not return directly to the house. The plantation's silence, usually so absolute, becomes a fragile thing, threatened by every glance, every accidental brush of fingers over a cooling piece of metal. Yet the two continue their dance, each step weighted with the knowledge that discovery would mean separation, punishment, perhaps worse. The blacksmith's hammer, once a tool of labor, becomes a metronome for their stolen time, each strike a reminder of what is at stake. Then, one night, as the rain drums gently on the forge's roof, they stand closer than before, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the anvil, close enough for him to see the freckles on her cheekbone, for her to notice the scar above his thumb. The air smells of wet wood and hot iron, and the flames cast shifting patterns on the wall, as though the night itself is conspiring. He hesitates, then touches her wrist, a gesture so small it would go unnoticed in the ledger. But here, in the glow of the forge, it is an act of quiet defiance. For a moment, the plantation's order falters, the distance between them collapses, and what began as curiosity becomes something forbidden, something alive. The rain outside intensifies, and the sound of it on the roof is loud enough to hide their voices, should either speak, but neither does. Instead, the silence between them is its own kind of conversation, one that requires no ink, no ledger, no law. And so, in the shadow of the forge, in the scent of smoke and damp earth, in the pulse between his hammer and her heartbeat, a secret is born, one that will not, cannot, be recorded in any official record, but will live nonetheless, bright and dangerous as a forgotten coal burning in the dark. That night, when she returns to her room, her hands still smell of iron, her breath still quickens with the memory of firelight, and the plantation's accustomed quiet suddenly feels like a lie waiting to unravel. There comes a morning at Fort Hill when the Calhoun daughter wakes to the scent of camphor rising from her pillow, a sharpness that cannot mask the nausea flooding her with every movement. The house is still, the only sound a single dove calling from the oak, but beneath her skin, the truth hums like a tuning fork struck. She is carrying a child. In the looking glass, her face is unfamiliar, the bones sharper, the gaze shadowed, the hands restlessly tracing the silk of her nightdress, as if checking for cracks in her composure. She knows, as every woman of the household knows, the line between discovery and disgrace is thinner than a strand of her own hair. the difference between life and ruin, as fragile as the last frost on the sill. Downstairs, the plantation office smells of ink and oak, the scratch of the quill echoing the overseer's footsteps above, each one a reminder of systems built to preserve bloodlines. Bloodlines now tangled in ways the ledger cannot parse. The law, of course, is clear. A woman's body is not her own, not in this house, not in this state, not when the future of the Calhoun name is at stake. The codes of 1843 South Carolina are as unyielding as the ledger's spine, and the penalty for intimacy between a white woman and an enslaved man is worse than silence. It is erasure of body, of legacy, of future. The heiress has learned, from half-heard whispers and sudden disappearances among the household staff, that the overseer's whip is not the only weapon at Fort Hill. There is also the quiet violence of Sale, the unsmiling doctor summoned from Pendleton, the hastily worded letter to a distant cousin. Would you confess your secret to a stranger, or seal your lips tighter than a ledger binding? In her bedroom, the Calhoun daughter grips the bedpost, knuckles pale against dark wood, and wonders how many times the doctor's bag has passed through these halls. How many women have stood where she stands, caught between a choice that is no choice at all. She recalls the day the overseer struck a field hand for insolence, the way the man's back became a map of welts, how the Calhouns sat at supper, as though nothing had happened. She remembers her brother's voice, raised in Washington, claiming that the plantation economy is the natural order, that the races were never meant to mix, and she wonders if he has ever seen a man flinch at the sight of his own child. The air in her room, always thick with the scent of lavender and lamp oil, turns cloying, and she unfastens the shutter, letting in the coolness of morning, the scent of turned earth and distant rain. And so, in the shadowed corners of the house, a new dance begins. She learns to time her steps, to avoid the overseer's glance, to make her sickbed a fortress and her silence a shield. The physician, an aging man with eyes like chips of flint, examines her with hands that smell of carbolic and pipe smoke, his questions sharp as a scalpel. She tells him what he wants to hear. Bad oysters, a fever in the night, the grip of autumn damp, and watches his face for disbelief. He leaves her a vial of tonic, bitter as gall, but she does not drink. Instead, she studies her reflection in the glass, tracing the hollows beneath her eyes, feeling the weight of her father's expectations pressing on her lungs. At night, she lies awake, listening to the creak of the bed frame, the whistle of the wind through the shutters, the faint hum of the quarters beyond the lawn. She thinks of the blacksmith, his hands calloused from the forge, the way he looked at her in firelight, and she wonders if he knows, if he fears, if he dares hope. She turns the events of the last months over and over in her mind, searching for a way out, an herb from the root doctor in the quarters, a coach to Charleston, a note tucked into a seam, but every path ends in loss, either for her, for him, for the child, or for all three. And so, the days stretch, each one longer than the last, the house's walls pressing closer, the clock in the hall ticking like a judge's gavel. The heiress moves through her routine, stitching embroidery, sitting quietly at dinner, nodding when spoken to, but inside, she is counting, days, weeks, the slow, relentless march toward revelation. The only safe place is her mind, and there, she watches, she waits, she plans, she becomes a scholar of absence, a master of illusion, a woman who knows better than anyone what it means to carry a secret that could burn the house down. And yet, despite her vigilance, despite her silence, there is no hiding the truth from the ledger, from the overseer's watchful eye, or from the law, which sees all, records all, and forgives nothing. The future is coming, as certain as winter, and she stands in her bedroom, hands pressed to her belly, breathing in the scent of camphor, lavender, and fear, wondering who she will become when morning comes, mother, criminal, exile, or ghost. The summer nights at Fort Hill hum with secrets, but the cotton field's heat cannot mute the undercurrent of murmured voices that swirl through the quarters. The cabins, their stone walls still clinging to midday's warmth, are hives of quiet conversation after the overseer's whistle fades. An old woman named Daphne is the first to notice the child's eyes, too light, too quick, shaped like the Calhoun daughters, but framed by lashes dark as the fire's coals. She gathers the children close, her tattered shawl smelling of time and sweat, and whispers a rhyme about birds that fly by moonlight and babies that outgrow their cradles overnight. The other women nod, their voices low as the wind in the cane, their hands never idle, shelling butter beans, stitching rags into quilts, rubbing salve into field burns. They know more than they admit, these women whose days are hemmed in by the overseer's watch, whose nights are their own, however briefly. A young girl named Izzy, all angles and elbows, reports that she has seen the Calhoun heiress cross the garden at dusk, her bare feet silent on the damp grass, her shawl drawn tight as a drumhead. The overseer, she says, walks closer to the house now, his boots polished, his voice sharp as a quill. The women speak among themselves behind cupped hands, in tones that blend warning and wonder, for they have seen white women in this house go pale with child before their bridal veils were made. But a child with skin the color of molasses beneath a summer sun, that is a fact as dangerous as a burning torch. The blacksmith's forge burns late into the night, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a message the women understand, their ears more attuned than the master's, their memories longer than the plantation's wall. The air between the cabins carries the scent of the fire, the tang of iron, and the far-off sweetness of honeysuckle, a scent that seems to taunt the household with its promise of tangled vines and unchecked growth. Would you keep silent for your own safety? Or would you risk a whisper, even if it meant someone else's pain? A boy named Ned, his feet as tough as leather, claims he saw the overseer in the barn, talking to a stranger who had ridden up from Pendleton, a well-suited man with a book in hand and a scent of pipe smoke clinging to his frock coat. Ned, whose ears are sharp enough to find a dropped pin in the field, tells the women the stranger asked for inventory, names, ages, descriptions. Ned mimics the overseer's laughter, too loud for comfort, and the women grow quiet, their breath shallow. In another cabin, an old man named Sawney, his back bent from years of work, carves a tiny wooden bird and hands it to the youngest child, a toy that could never be traced, a comfort no one else would ever know. Meanwhile, the cook, her hands red from cutting peppers, hums a song about sweet Moses and Pharaoh's daughter, a song that has crossed the rivers and outlasted the papers, the ledgers, the laws. The women know where to hide a baby's cry, whose herbs will slow a birth, whose prayers will protect a child from sale. They have lived the truth, the house will never admit. Families are built not just by blood, but by hiding, by silence, by the slow accumulation of glances and nods and stories carried in the night air. Their voices are their archive, and in them, the child's future is already taking shape. But their wisdom is shadowed by fear. The overseer's boots, the tightening of the law, the sudden absence of faces that once turned toward them from the field at midday. The quarters are never truly safe, just safe enough for a time. On the back of a lard bucket, one of the women scratches 2 lines, names that could belong to anyone or no one. The bucket is stored behind the cook stove, where the air is thick with the scent of grease and charred wood. Its surface is faded, its contents unreadable to those who cannot hear the whispers. It will be found decades later, after the house is empty and the ledgers are dust. The blacksmith's wife, whose braids smell faintly of lavender stolen from the garden, presses a tiny iron ring into her own child's palm and tells her, "Never tell a soul," a lesson that is a gift and a curse, a secret that could warm or burn. The quarters seem to hold their breath in these weeks, every voice a little softer, every footstep a little lighter, every fire banked just a little sooner. The women's stories grow sharper, their warnings more pointed, their hands reaching for the children more often. The overseer begins to sleep near the locked grain shed, his rifle propped within reach, his presence a reminder that nothing is truly hidden, that the ledger's silence is always provisional. The air in the quarters is thick with the scent of drying tobacco and the sweat of too many bodies, and the women's whispered words carry farther than they ever have before. As the moon rises, the wind pulls at the edges of the cloth hung to air on a line, and the quarters are awash in shifting shadows. The women watch the house, its windows glowing yellow in the dark, and wonder how much longer the quiet can last. The blacksmith's voice, when he comes home late, is lower than ever, the fire in his eyes banked. His wife, picking peppercorns from his pockets, finds a smooth, unmarked stone. The quarters hold their secrets, like the river holds the drowned, deep, unseen, and powerful. The overseer's horse paws the ground, the crickets call, and the night folds over Fort Hill like a quilt, patchwork, never seamless, hiding what is underneath. The air inside Fort Hill's drawing room is thick with beeswax and the scent of bourbon spilt on polished mahogany. The Calhoun patriarch sits by the window, his fingers drumming against the glass, counting the hours until his lawyer arrives from Pendleton. The evening's argument, carried in shouts muffled by wood and drapery, hangs over the house like gun smoke after a duel. The Calhoun daughter, no longer called youngest, now called sister, sits in a chair by the hearth, her hands wrapped in her shawl, the rough weave chafing her knuckles. Her breath is steady only because she has willed it so. The evening's revelations have ruptured the family's careful balance, the ledgers and ledger's order suddenly insufficient to contain a truth so physical, so plain, it cannot be erased by ink or prayer. Accounts suggest the master summoned the physician for a second time, demanded answers. Ledger entries mark the day as a gap in the household routine, days on which no cotton is weighed, no correspondence sent, no guests received. The law, ever swift in South Carolina, had whispered back to him the only answer he required. Would you look your child in the eye before denying her, or avert your gaze and allow the law to do its work? In the kitchen, the overseer slices bread with a sharpened blade. His shirt is damp and smells faintly of horse, a reminder of the ride he took at dawn to summon the master's lawyer. The house is quiet, but for the creak of a floorboard, the distant cry of the child, now separated from his mother, carried through the still air like a bell's echo. Servants move with care, the sound of their feet muffled by the day's gravity, the scent of herbs and lye soap rising from their work. Their faces are unreadable, their eyes cast down, their knowledge of what is unfolding unspoken but present. The Calhoun daughter's gown, usually fine muslin, is today homespun, a dress she once wore to the kitchens, now made her prison. Her arms are bare beneath her shawl, marked with impressions of fingernails, a pattern left by her own hands as she gripped her arms, willing herself to remain still. The master's wife, once chatelaine of the household, now stands apart, her hands clasped, as if in prayer, her lips moving soundlessly. The last time she spoke to her daughter, her voice carried the scent of camphor and by morning, the household's rituals are fractured. The ledgers are collected, reviewed, their pages shuffled in search of patterns, gaps, omissions. The family's lawyer arrives in a carriage that smells of leather and river mud, his boots loud in the hall, his satchel bulges with papers, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The overseer's gun, previously leaning against the wall, is now within reach. In the quarters, the air is thick with smoke and dread, the children kept inside, the women stirring pots that do not smell of food, but of something herbal, bitter, meant to calm nerves and quiet tongues. The Calhoun daughter's gaze, once restless, is now fixed and distant, as though she is already seeing another life, another world, one in which her choices are remembered differently. At noon, the master walks out to meet the overseer by the barn, the two men speaking in low tones, the wind carrying bits of their conversation, words like disposal, arrangement, authority. The law, ever present, smiles from the margins of the ledger. According to the statutes, the child is now the master's property, to be used, sold, or discarded as necessary. The mother, meanwhile, is consigned to her bedroom, her meals brought up on a tray, her privacy revoked, her voice reduced to whispers behind closed doors. The overseer's boots now frequent the stairs outside her room. By nightfall, the family's wrath has already begun to unmake the lives it once made. The Calhoun daughter sits by her window, her breath fogging the glass, her fingernails tracing the panes like a prisoner marking the passage of time. She recalls a story. The patriarch once told it to her, at supper, of a fox caught in a trap, gnawing its paw to escape. The moral pain is the price of freedom, but only if you can bear it, only if you can live with what remains. She presses her forehead to the cool glass, listens for the baby's cry, but hears only silence, not peace, but a vacancy. The overseer's boots, still echoing outside her door, are a warning and a promise. Some ledgers can be altered, some lives erased, some truths held at bay only so long. Beyond her room, the plantation's land stretches out under the moonlight, its fields empty, its quarters quiet, its future as uncertain as the wind through the oaks. The law will have its say, the church will keep its silence, the ledgers will record what must be recorded. But inside the house, a mother's hands still ache, a child's cry still echoes in memory, and the iron ring, for now, remains unspoken, silent, hidden, waiting to be claimed by a past that has not yet ended. The stench of smoke curls through the windows of Fort Hill long before dawn, threading past the curtains and into the rooms where the Calhouns sleep, restless between silk and linen. The sky outside is not yet gray, not yet morning, but already it glows orange above the quarters, first a flicker, then a line, then an appetite. The overseer is already out there, boots pounding the damp earth, his voice sharp as a whip, giving orders that scatter through the smoke like sparks. The Calhoun daughter, roused by the clamor, presses her hands to the glass, her breath a pale ghost against the panes. She watches flames leap from roof to roof, the barracks of stone and wood collapsing into embers, the gardens she once walked with the blacksmith, now would you run toward the fire, or let it erase what the ledger could not contain? Downstairs, the household stirs to life, lanterns lit, voices raised, feet heavy on the stairs. The master, half-dressed, barks for the overseer, for the sheriff, for someone to explain what has happened. The house, usually so ordered, is now chaos. A maid drops a tray, china shattering on the tiles. A man's silhouette looms in the doorway, blocking the light. The scent of singed cotton and salt pork drifts in with the servants rushing past. The Calhoun daughter, still at the window, hears the crackle of burning timber, the low moan of a beam giving way, the distant rhythmic thud of a bucket brigade forming at the well. But she also hears another sound, a keening, low and constant, that weaves through the noise, a thread of grief so relentless it seems to pull the night tighter around her. She thinks of the women in the quarters, Daphne, with her rhymes and herbs, Issy, all elbows and eyes, the cook who hummed hymns while she worked. She thinks too of the blacksmith. Where is he now that his forge is hungry? And the child, whose existence was a secret the house could not bear. The overseer's return is sudden, his boots scraping mud across the hall, his shirt damp with sweat and river water. He mutters to the master, words too low to catch, but she hears arson and accident and cannot say, phrases that scatter like embers, igniting new fears. The master's face darkens. He turns to the sheriff, who arrived with saddle leather and gun oil on his coat, and the two men disappear into the study, a room suddenly thick with the scent of whiskey and suspicion. The law, embodied now in the sheriff's brass buttons and the master's clenched jaw, has questions: who started the fire? Why now? Was it escape, or erasure, or simply the spark of a lamp overturned in haste? The Calhoun daughter, still upstairs, presses her forehead to the glass, her skin chill despite the heat of the flames. She remembers the stories whispered among the field hands, tales of men and women who disappeared into the night, of children who vanished between one harvest and the next. She wonders if fire, for all its violence, can be a kind of mercy, a way to burn away the evidence, to leave only ash and questions in its wake. But mercy is not a word often spoken at Fort Hill, and the smell of burning is not an absolution, but a warning. Outside, the night is alive with motion and noise, horses galloping, men shouting, the hiss of water meeting flame. The quarters, once a cluster of stone and shadow, are now a pyre, their walls crumbling, their secrets exposed to the sky. The light of the fire flickers across the faces of the gathered, enslaved and free, master and maid, all united for a moment by the spectacle of destruction. The overseer's whip, usually so present, is nowhere to be seen. In its place is a bucket, a shovel, a shared urgency to save what can be saved. But beneath the activity, the air is thick with something else: suspicion, fear, the unspoken knowledge that this fire was not random, that it was born of the same tensions that have simmered beneath Fort Hill's surface for years. The sheriff's gaze lingers on the faces of the field hands. The master's fingers drum against his thigh. The Calhoun daughter, watching from above, feels the weight of something shifting, something irrevocable. By dawn, the fire is spent, the quarters reduced to smoldering heaps of stone and charred timber. The air is thick with the scent of wet ash and something richer, darker, the smell of endings, of secrets turned to vapor. The master and the sheriff walk among the ruins, boots crunching on debris, voices low. The overseer hovers at the edge, his usual swagger subdued, his eyes darting from face to face, as if searching for guilt, for defiance, for a story that matches the one he will tell. The Calhoun daughter, finally descending the stairs, steps into a hallway that smells of smoke and lamp oil, of fear and something like relief. She knows, as everyone at Fort Hill now knows, that some fires cannot be put out with water, some burns linger, some scars are as deep as the soil, and some questions once asked can never be unasked. As the sun rises over the smoldering ruins, the only sound is the slow drip of water from the buckets, the creak of a beam settling, the distant call of a whippoorwill, a bird whose cry, some say, carries news from the unseen world. The overseer's horse, restless in its stall, paws the ground. Somewhere, a child coughs. The women from the quarters huddle together, their voices low, their faces turned from the light. And the Calhoun daughter, standing at the edge of the devastation, realizes that the fire has not just destroyed, it has revealed. In the ashes, in the silence, in the spaces where the quarters once stood, there is a truth too stark to ignore. Fort Hill is not just a house, not just a name, but a place where the past is always burning and the future is never certain. The fire, for all its fury, has left behind something more dangerous than ruins. It has left memory, and memory, as the overseer knows well, is the one thing that cannot be whipped into silence. There is a morning at Fort Hill when the overseer's horse stands hitched by the front steps before sunup, its flanks steaming in the damp, its breath frosting as it stamps and pulls at the reins. The scent of fresh straw and river mud drifts from its hooves, and its nostrils flare as the overseer emerges, dragging a sack that scrapes against the stones with a sound like a knife on slate. The house, usually stirring with the first light, is preternaturally still. No voices carry from the kitchen, no footsteps echo on the stairs, no clink of silver sounds from the breakfast room. The Calhoun daughter, locked in her room, presses her forehead to the window pane, straining to hear any cry, any word, any sign. She waits for the sound she dreads most, the shrill protest of a child being taken, of a life being wrenched from its moorings. But the morning yields only silence, heavy and unbroken. Accounts from the quarters, passed in whispers between buckets drawn from the well, say the child is bundled in a blanket that once belonged to the heiress herself, a scrap of fine wool that smells of lavender and grief. The overseer's boots are dulled with mud from the previous night's rain. His spurs chime softly as he lifts the bundle into the arms of a stranger, a man whose hands are chapped and whose coat smells of tobacco and lamp oil. There is no ceremony, no farewell, only a businesslike exchange, a nod, a receipt tucked into a pocket, the soft creak of saddle leather as the stranger mounts and wheels his horse toward the river road, the child cradled before him, already fading from memory, from the ledger, from the life he was meant to have. Would you have let your child be taken, knowing silence was the only protection you could offer, or risked everything for a last, desperate embrace? The child's journey is marked by the rhythm of hooves on wet earth, the lap of water against the dock, the clang of chains as the riverboat casts off. There is no cradle song, only the creak of timber, the slap of rope against mast, the distant cry of a heron startling from the reeds. The towns along the river have names lost to legend, their streets lined with warehouses and offices where men in tall hats study papers by lamplight, their hands never quite clean of ink. The child, too young to speak his own name, is passed from hand to hand, each transfer a fresh erasure, each new holding pen a world away from the stone barracks and the iron ring left behind in hiding. The women who receive him, whose skirts rustle with the coins they keep sewn into the hems, know not to ask questions, not to wonder at the lightness of his skin or the curl of his hair. They know only that he is merchandise, his future as negotiable as the cotton bales stacked on the dock, his value measured in silence and forgetfulness. In the quarters at Fort Hill the women gather, their voices low as bees in a hive, their fingers busy with mending and plaiting and the husking of corn. They do not speak of the child directly, but their stories shift, now threaded with tales of children stolen in the night, of mothers who wake to empty cradles, of rivers that carry secrets downstream. The scent of wood smoke and stewing greens fills the air, but beneath it is the sharper tang of loss, of memory stretched thin. The blacksmith, returning from a journey to Pendleton, or was it Greenville, finds his tools untouched, his forge cold, his name scratched from the new roster posted by the overseer's office. He asks no questions, makes no demands, but his hands shake as he lifts his hammer, as if it is suddenly too heavy for him to bear. The plantation office, usually a hive of activity, is quiet, the ledgers open on the desk, the inkwell dry, the master's quill lies untouched, the page where the child's name should be recorded, left blank, no birth, no baptism, no bill of sale. The oversight is not accidental, but deliberate. A gap in the record, a hole in the story, a silence maintained by mutual consent. The law, which sees all and forgives little, demands a reckoning for transgressions. But there is no reckoning here, only absence, only space where a life should be. The house itself, for all its grandeur, feels emptier, its walls echoing with the memory of a voice never raised, a laugh never heard, a future never claimed. At night, the river moves on, carrying barges and steamboats, and the occasional scrap of song. Somewhere downstream, the child sleeps beneath a quilt, pieced from remnants, his breath even, his dreams untroubled. For now, he will grow up in a world that will not claim him, among people who will not know his story, his name, his mother's face. He will learn to speak, to work, to hide the iron ring pressed into his palm by hands he cannot remember. The river, for all its depth and noise, cannot wash away the mark of his birth, nor the silence that surrounds it. He will carry both, unseen but felt, like a scar beneath the skin, like a memory waiting to be found. The overseer's horse, returned to its stable, snorts and paws the straw, its coat still damp from the morning's ride. The house, the quarters, the fields, all go about their business, as though nothing has happened. But beneath the routine, beneath the rhythm of plantation life, there is a hollowness, a space where a child should be. The Calhoun daughter, staring out at the river road, feels the emptiness like a wound, like a silence that will never heal. She knows, as only a mother can, that the ledger's greatest lie is not its ink, but its omissions, the lives erased, the stories untold, the futures stolen in the night. The river flows on, indifferent, carrying its secrets toward the sea, where even the strongest current cannot wash them clean. The smell of parchment and dust lingers in the attic at Fort Hill, where stacks of old ledgers, yellowed letters, and a family Bible have lain untouched for years, their edges softened by humidity and time. In the months after the fire, after the child's disappearance, after the silence that swallowed her voice, the Calhoun daughter returns again and again to this space, drawn by the chill of unspoken truths and the musty perfume of forgotten stories. Here, beneath the eaves where mice scuttle and sunlight filters in motes through a single cracked window, she finds a kind of sanctuary, one where her grief, her guilt, and her defiance can exist together, if only for an hour at a time. The air is thick with the scent of cedarwood and old ink, and every breath brings with it the echo of her own history, waiting to be remembered or erased. At first, she thinks of hiding, of folding herself into a corner, of becoming as invisible as the ledger's missing entries. But as weeks pass, and the household resumes its rituals of prayer and politeness, she realizes silence is not enough. If the ledgers can lie, so can she, not with her absence, but with her words. She runs her fingers along the Bible's worn spine, feeling the ridges where the gold foil has dulled, and pauses at a flyleaf marred by a faded blot of ink. With a quill sharpened to a fine point, she begins to write, her shaking hand betraying neither anger nor sorrow, simply necessity. The ink is watery, the letters uneven. She writes in the margins, between prayers beneath birth records, words meant for a future that may never come, but which she cannot help but hope for. She presses her palm to the page, and for a moment her fingers remember the forge's warmth, the texture of the iron ring, the beat of her own secret. Would you leave your truth where anyone could find it, or hide your words so deeply that only fate could uncover them? The Calhoun daughter, who once watched from her window, who once feared every shadow, now moves through the house in calculated rhythms, her presence unremarkable, her eyes downcast as she passes the overseer on the stairs. She learns the schedule of the maids, the habits of the manservant, the intervals when the master's study is empty. She watches the way the light falls through the muslin curtains at midday, the way the clock on the landing chimes the hours, the way the overseer's whistle, once so sharp, has lost its edge. The house, for all its grandeur, is now a place of waiting, waiting for forgiveness, for forgetfulness, for the next turning of the seasons. She knows that her words tucked into the Bible are a risk, but she also knows, from the hushed voices in the quarters, that some silences can be broken. On the first day of the new year, a visiting minister comes down from Pendleton, his coat smelling of snow and road dust, his voice gruff with age and tobacco. He sits at the head of the table, his face impassive as he reads from the family Bible, passages about justice and mercy, about the sins of the fathers and the secrets of the heart. The Calhoun daughter watches his fingers, roughened by years of ministry, as they turn the pages, pausing over dog-eared corners and hastily inked notes. She glances at the overseer, who stands near the door, arms crossed, and at her father, who sips bourbon and pretends not to notice the minister's hesitation. The air in the room is thick, with the scent of pine boughs and beeswax, with the weight of words unsaid and stories untold. She waits, heart pounding, for some sign that her confession has been found, that her truth has been heard. But the moment passes, the Bible closes, and the assembled guests stand to sing a hymn. In the months that follow, the household returns to its rhythms, cotton, ledgers, prayers, guests. The Calhoun daughter's gowns are mended, her hair pinned with combs, her smile forced at supper. She walks the grounds, her pace measured, her senses attuned to the slightest shift, the way the river sounds different after rain, the way the overseer's boots are softer on the stairs, the way the minister returned in spring, asks after her health with a weight she cannot quite name. She notices, too, how the servants glance at her when they think she is not looking, how their voices drop when she enters a room, how the air in the kitchen smells of rosemary and something sharper, hope, perhaps, or memory. Years later, when the house passes out of her hands, the Bible will be found, its margins filled with words that tell a story the ledgers could never contain. The ink will have faded, but the truth will remain, waiting for someone to see it, to read it, to hear the voice of a woman who, for all her privilege and peril, found the courage to mark her own place in the world. The winter winds will whistle through the shutters, the scent of dust and old paper will rise from the pages, and the Bible's edges, once smooth, will be worn at the corners, as if someone, in secret, has turned the pages many times, searching for what was lost, for what was hidden, for the fragile line between justice and mercy. There is a November, years after the fire and the disappearances and the Bible's silent testimony, when Fort Hill lies mostly empty, its fields fallow, its ledgers yellowing in drawers, its stories scattering like dandelion seeds on the wind. The house, once polished, now wears a patina of dust and sorrow, its floors creaking under feet that belong neither to Calhouns nor Clemsons, but to strangers and students and scholars who come and go with the seasons. The air inside is cool, laced with the scent of old varnish and the faint tang of iron, a scent that clings to the door hinges, the balustrade, the key resting on the mantel, grown dull from disuse. There is a hollowness here, as if the house itself is holding its breath, waiting for something long deferred. Years have passed since the overseer's whistle, since the crack of the bullwhip, since the river carried the child away. The world has turned. South Carolina has fallen, slavery abolished, the old order dismantled, and yet some truths remain, buried but not forgotten. One day, a man walks up the drive, his steps echoing in the stillness, his coat plain, his posture erect. He was not born on this land, but his blood contains its history, his memories shaped by stories told in hushed tones, by mothers and aunts, by words written in margins, by a ring passed from hand to hand, from hiding place to hiding place, until it found its way to his palm. He stands now before the house, feeling the weight of the iron ring in his pocket, its edges warmed by his skin, its surface worn smooth by generations of secrecy. Would you cross the threshold of a house, built on pain, or let your ancestors' silence be their only monument? Inside, the curator, a woman with glasses perched on her nose and a clipboard clutched to her chest, lifts the ring from its felt-lined tray, her gloved hand careful, respectful. She speaks of provenance, of missing stories, of families scattered by sale and war and time. The visitor listens, but his mind is on the fields, the river, the hidden corners of the house where his forebears lived, loved, and lost. He breathes in the scent of old wood and beeswax, the faint tang of iron, the lingering perfume of lavender that clings improbably to the corners of the oldest rooms. He stands at the window where, decades before, a young woman watched the world change and waited for a reckoning that never came, not for her, not in her lifetime. The curator's words drift, then fade. The past is here, in the silence between sentences, in the ring cradled in cotton, in the ledger whose pages still bear the faintest trace of ink where a name should have been written. Outside, the wind stirs the remnants of the gardens, the crumbled barracks, the empty space where once the quarters stood. The air smells of damp earth and rotting leaves. A wood thrush calls from the shadows, its song clear and sad, a lament for things lost and things remembered. The visitor walks the grounds, his boots kicking up dust, his fingers brushing the cold stone of the foundation, the rough bark of an ancient oak, the rusted hinge of a door that hasn't opened in years. He pauses by a patch of earth that might once have been a garden tended by women whose names are forgotten, and when he leaves, the curator replaces the ring in its case, the glass lid clicking shut with a sound like a key turning in a lock, like a ledger closing, like a stone sealing a tomb. The house, empty once more, waits not for the return of its former masters, but for the next visitor, the next story, the next chance for the past to speak its truth. The fields beyond are quiet, the river far away, the ring's story only half told. But for now, the scent of iron lingers, a whisper of memory, a promise that some things, once lost, can still be found. If only you know where to look, if only you are brave enough to ask, if only you are willing to listen. The parlor of Fort Hill is quiet now, the air scented with wax and lavender, the sunlight falling in pale rectangles across the floor, where guests once spoke in hushed tones of politics and power. The house, nearly 2 centuries old, sits like a relic of another era, its walls lined with oil portraits, its floors worn smooth by countless feet, some that marched by law, others that moved in secret. There are tours these days, visitors with curious eyes who file through the rooms, listening to stories of John C. Calhoun, of compromise and nullification, of the rise and fall of a political dynasty. The ledgers, once jealously guarded, now sit in glass cases, their pages open for anyone to see, columns of cotton, lists of supplies, and in the margins, the faint scratchings of a life the house tried to forget. Clemson +1. Visitors drift from room to room, their voices low in the presence of so much history, their footsteps soft on the aged wood. Some pause by the window, gazing out at what remains of the gardens, the grass grown wild, the stones of the old slave quarters almost hidden by nettle and clover. Some lean closer to read the names on the inventory lists: Sawney, Tilla, Ned, Issy, each a silent echo of a life once measured in bushels. Would you believe the story the ledgers tell, or search for the echoes between the lines? In the museum's archive, there is a box that contains the iron ring, the one that passed from hand to hand, from memory to memory, from silence to silence. A curator, gloved hands trembling, lifts it from its velvet bed and describes its journey, found in an attic, donated by a distant relative, provenanced through oral history, research, and guesswork. The ring is small, unadorned, its surface dulled by time and touch. It does not gleam or impress, but in its simplicity lies its power, an artifact of resistance, of hope, of a mother's love that refused to be erased. In the next case, a visitor points out a Bible, its spine cracked, its pages dog-eared, its margins filled with delicate, desperate script, words written in secret, meant for someone who might never read them, preserved by chance and necessity. The curator does not know the author's name, but for a moment, as fingertips brush the glass, the past feels close enough to touch. Clemson. Outside, the university bustles, students crossing the quad, voices echoing, the world moving forward. The land, once devoted to cotton and control, is. There are those who say the past is best left alone, that the ledgers tell the only story worth knowing, that the ashes have grown cold. But in every quiet corner of Fort Hill, in the archives and artifacts, in the spaces between tours and lectures, there is a presence, not a ghost, but a memory, a question, a call to witness what was, to imagine what might have been, to demand what still must be. The ring, the Bible, the names on the list, each is a reminder that history is not only what is written, but what is felt, what is hidden, what is passed down from lip to lip, from heart to heart. At the end of the tour, visitors linger in the gift shop, flipping through books, studying photographs, tracing the outlines of the old plantation on maps. Some pause at the statue of John C. Calhoun, his bronze face stern, his legacy as contested as the land he once ruled. Others wander into the garden, where the scent of lavender still clings to the air, where the earth, for all its scars, still yields flowers and weeds in equal measure. And as the last visitor leaves, as the door shuts softly behind them, the house is silent again, its stories waiting for the next curious ear, the next questioning mind, the next reckoning with the truths the ledgers could not hold back forever. And so Fort Hill stands, monument and museum, relic and classroom, prison and promise, a place where the echoes of the past are never truly silenced, and where the future is still being written, one memory, one ring, one voice at a time.